Today's consumers expect to see advertisements featuring myriad images of ethnic minority models. These models represent aspirational figures that depict success and, more importantly, beauty or attractiveness. Consumers look to their images to learn what to wear and what to buy. However, this has not always been the case. Exotic they may have been, but to most consumers they were not to be emulated in how they looked or in what they bought. The idea on the part of larger society that Blacks, Hispanics, or Asians could reflect the ideal self of the average consumer is a relatively recent societal shift, starting at the beginning of the 1970s. It resulted to a large extent from governmental actions, legislative and judicial, and sprung from changing U.S. demographics and public opinion. In this video, we examine how American society and consumers have come not only to accept, but to expect multicultural images and advertisements. We in turn associate this evolution with changing demographics and governmental actions. Advertisements for this study have been collected via a content analysis of 50 years of advertisements in Sports Illustrated, a bi-weekly magazine targeting a primarily male readership with a total paid subscription of over 3 million readers. Readers look to these ads for buying advice and for images that help them define their ideal self. This study included a content analysis of advertisements for male fashion and grooming products in 5 randomly selected issues per year from its inception in 1954 through 2004. This number of issues represents about 10% of total SI issues. Government and industry-created categorization schemes for grooming and fashion products determined which product advertisements to choose. The authors followed Khazarjian's 1977 guidelines to ensure an objective, systematic, and quantifiable content analysis. Ultimately, 1,031 advertisements were coded. 2 coders, the author and a graduate research assistant, recorded the presence, number, and apparent ethnicity of any models featured in each ad. Those containing models of color were further analyzed as to their position and role in the advertisement. First, it is important to examine basic demographic changes. The U.S. is a nation of immigrants. Although there have been periods of limited immigration, for example, during the 1920s when Asian immigration was limited, changing immigration patterns have impacted the ethnic and racial makeup of the U.S. population. Between the period 1940 and 2000, the percentage of whites to the overall U.S. population declined from over 88% to about 75%. At the same time, the Black or African American population increased from almost 10 to 12.3%. Hispanics experienced the most rapid growth, from only 1.4% of the U.S. population in 1940 to eclipsing the Black population by 2000. Meanwhile, the Asian population experienced the most rapid proportionate growth, from only 0.2% of the U.S. population in 1940 to 3.6% in 2000. And various societal and governmental changes have increased the visibility of African Americans, as well as Hispanics and Asians, in the eyes of U.S. consumers and society in general. This timeline summarizes 12 key turning points that have impacted how society and ultimately consumers view minority models. We will review these events before we examine a series of representations. African Americans were featured in American media from before the beginning of the 20th century. Although there were a few representations of beauty from the early to mid-20th century, including Lena Horne in the 1940s to Dorothy Dandridge in the 1950s, and while baseball legend Jackie Robinson appeared on Wheaties cereal boxes in the 1950s, for every aspirational image there were scores of stereotypical images from Aunt Jemima to Uncle Ben. Despite their large proportion of the U.S. population, American consumers did not see Blacks as aspirational figures, given their second-class status in American society and consumer culture. However, following World War II, a grassroots civil rights movement combined with federal action to change society's and the market's perceptions of African Americans in media, including advertising imagery. The 1954 Brown v. Board of Education U.S. Supreme Court decision is among the most significant judicial turning points in the development of the United States. It dismantled the legal basis for racial segregation in schools and other public facilities. It declared that the discriminatory nature of racial segregation, quote, violates the 14th Amendment to the U.S. Constitution, which guarantees all citizens equal protection of the laws, unquote. It ultimately changed the role of Blacks in our society, including their role in advertising and how consumers saw them.
I still have a dream.
Another turning point was the Civil Rights March of 1963. The March on Washington for Jobs and Freedom was a large political rally that took place in Washington, D.C. on August 28th of that year. Reverend Martin Luther King Jr. delivered his historic I Have a Dream speech, advocating racial harmony at the Lincoln Memorial during the march. The march is widely credited with helping to pass the landmark Civil Rights Act of 1964 and the National Voting Rights Act of 1965, both outlawing racial discrimination in a variety of venues and activities.
Days of rioting in a Negro section of Los Angeles.
The assassination of Dr. King in 1968 precipitated race riots throughout the U.S., further bringing the plight of blacks to the national consciousness and changing societal perceptions. In the late 1960s and early 1970s, other court actions and pieces of legislation followed. In 1971, the U.S. Supreme Court upheld busing as a means of desegregating public schools. The Equal Educational Opportunities Act of 1974 prohibited discrimination against faculty, staff, and students, including racial segregation of students. These governmental actions combined with grassroots movements. The Black Power movement of the 1960s and early 1970s emphasized racial pride and the creation of black political and cultural institutions to nurture and promote black collective interests, advance values, and secure autonomy. Public opinion relative to African Americans was changing as well. In the U.S., the 1960s, 70s, and 80s saw significant changes in the attitudes among Americans concerning the racial integration of neighborhoods and schools. Findings from the Gallup poll public opinion surveys indicated that between 1963 and 1990, white Americans became much more accepting of the idea of living in the same neighborhood as African Americans. In 1963, 45% of white Americans said they would move if African Americans came to live next door. This decreased to only 5% in 1990. Let us now explore the intersection of consumers and Hispanics. Mexican farm and railroad workers had been working near the U.S. side of the U.S.-Mexican border since the mid-19th century. However, following the Mexican Revolution in 1910 and World War I, the Mexican economy declined, while workers were needed in the U.S. during the war. In 1924, the U.S. Border Patrol was created and the concept of illegal Mexican workers was born. Realizing the growing need for agricultural workers during the Second World War, the United States signed the Bracero Treaty, which opened the door for legal immigration of Mexican laborers. Between the period of 1942 and 1964, more than 4 million Mexican workers were imported into the U.S. as braceros to work temporarily on contract to United States growers and ranchers. The idea was that these workers, entering the U.S. with a work contract, would return to Mexico when the contract expired. By the end of World War II, Mexican workers were ousted from their jobs by workers coming out of wartime industries and by returning servicemen. In 1949, the Border Patrol seized nearly 280,000 illegal immigrants. By 1953, the numbers had grown to more than 865,000. As a result, the U.S. government felt pressure to act. In 1954, the new commissioner of the Immigration and Naturalization Service, General Joseph Swing, created Operation Wetback. Swing oversaw the U.S. Border Patrol and enlisted them along with local police to deport illegal, primarily Mexican or Mexican-looking aliens. In 1954 alone, over 1 million illegal aliens were discovered. Despite these actions, Latinos had begun to impact American culture, including consumer culture.
You're in the Army of Liberty with Pancho Villa.
Despite the growing number of Hispanics in the U.S., by 1940, Hispanics accounted for only 1.4% of the U.S. population. By 1970, 4.5%. Given the relatively small numbers and low household incomes, society felt little impact by this group and therefore saw few distinctly Latino images in advertisements. The idea of aspirational or glamorized Hispanic images simply didn't exist at this point. Rather, these were the sorts of Latino images that consumers were expecting to see in media, including ads.
I am the Frito Bandito. I just find out the Frito Bureau investigation looks for me.
The term Asian American is used to describe a heterogeneous group of people in the U.S. who find their roots in China, the Philippines, Japan, India, Vietnam, Korea, Pakistan, and other countries. Because Asian Americans account for less than 5% of the U.S. population, the diversity of the group is often disregarded. While there are some commonalities across ethnic subgroups, there are significant differences. The earliest Asians to settle in America were Filipinos, who first arrived in 1763. In 1778, the first Chinese sailors arrived in Hawaii. Throughout the late 19th and early 20th centuries, Chinese, Japanese, Korean, and Filipino immigrants were lured to Hawaii by companies that promised them money and better lives as laborers on Hawaii's sugar plantations. During this same time period, the majority of Asian immigrants on the U.S. mainland were found in the West, attracted to jobs as miners and laborers on the Transcontinental Railroad. By the early 20th century, upon arrival in the U.S., Asians entered a culture that already included a strong anti-Asian sentiment, largely motivated by the threat that Asian workers posed to other people's jobs. Labor unions and politicians banded together to pass legislation to limit Asian immigration and land ownership. Also at this time, the U.S. Supreme Court denied people born in various Asian countries the opportunity to become U.S. citizens. Immigration of Asian Americans was greatly affected by U.S. war involvement from the 1940s to the 1970s, from World War II, the Korean War, to the Vietnam War. The Hart-Celler Act of 1965 eliminated highly restrictive national origins quotas, designed among other things to restrict the immigration of Asians. The new system, based on skills and familial relationships with U.S. residents, opened U.S. borders to immigration from Asia for the first time in nearly half a century. The technology boom of the 1990s brought another influx of Asian immigrants, with a large number of Asian Indians moving to the U.S. Between 1990 and 2000, the Asian Indian population in the U.S. grew over 130%, or 10 times the national growth rate. Since the 1970s, the population of Asian Americans has been growing in terms of numbers and visibility. However, there is still a widespread perception that Asian Americans are not American, but are instead perpetual foreigners, even when they are native-born U.S. citizens. But many activists and academics have identified an Asian American movement similar to the civil rights movement, and note that there is a growing Asian American presence in the media, which is in many ways similar to the Black Power movement of the 1960s.
How do you get shirts so clean, Mr. Lee?
Ancient Chinese secret.
Nonetheless, consumers have been accustomed to stereotypical Asian ad images. From the stereotyped Chinese laundry and a Jell-O ad from the 1960s and 1970s, back to the turn of the 20th century, where ads didn't just exploit the then popular urban legend that Chinese people ate rats. They also underscored the intensity of American xenophobia of the day. In the first ad, "They must go" refers both to the rodents and to the Chinese. Despite their long presence in the U.S. and their growing numbers relative to the U.S. population, for all intents and purposes, African American, Latino, or Asian images were irrelevant to the vast majority of American consumers. They simply were not seen, except as stereotyped images used by sellers to communicate messages quickly to targeted buyers. Now let's explore how these images have evolved, and consumers' views and expectations along with them, from the mid-1950s through the 21st century. The representation in this 1958 advertisement for Courtaulds Color-Ray shirts is typical of African American depictions through the late 1960s, early 1970s. The second-class status of the African American in U.S. society up through the civil rights era of the 1960s meant that consumers expected to see African Americans in supporting roles in ads. These were safe representations. Here we have a cartoon representation of a white model in a gym sporting the shirt being advertised. The black figure is in the background, providing only context for the ad. Kasarjian's 1969 Journal of Marketing Research study, The Negro in American Advertising, found that in 1946, 78% of blacks depicted in ads were shown as having laborer or service jobs: maid, waiter, slave, field hand, personal servant, as Kasarjian stated, the Aunt Jemima or the Uncle Tom. An additional 15% were entertainers or sports participants, as in this ad. By 1956, the 78% labor services representation figure had fallen to 52%, and the 15% entertainer sports figure had increased to 36%. Consumers were also comfortable with seeing black models as non-American or exotic figures. Here we see two ads, one from 1959 for Orlon shirts, one from 1960 for Janssen swimwear. In each, the African-American or black models were right where American consumers expected them, in the background or in service capacities, and in exotic or non-American contexts. As an indication of consumers' unwillingness or lack of preparation to view minority models, this study uncovered no ethnic minority ad images from 1960 through 1969. As a result of the U.S. Civil Rights Movement, society and consumers became more receptive to associating minority models or celebrities with products they would want to buy. This 1969 ad for Wigwam socks depicts the first verifiable Latino image in the ads analyzed for this study. Here we see Pancho Gonzalez, the world-famous tennis champion. Also in 1969, non-celebrity African-American models began to appear in ads targeting general audiences. Here we see a 1969 ad for Vitalis hair groomer. What is interesting is the placement of the African-American model in this ad. Unlike depictions less than 10 years earlier, he is in the foreground, a key element of the ad. Here we see a 1975 ad for Interwoven Pro Socks featuring African-American baseball legend Willie Mays. Less than 30 years after Jackie Robinson broke the color barrier in Major League Baseball, what is significant about this ad is that Mays appears on his own in this ad targeting general audiences, not needing support from white models. A challenge in analyzing Hispanic or Latino images is the difficulty of objectively distinguishing a Latino model. In this 1978 advertisement for Montgomery Ward's men's clothing, it is worth noting that both models have dark hair and dark eyes. Gone are the blonde hair and blue eyes found a decade earlier in similar ads. This 1984 ad for Ridgeview basketball thick-skin socks has two celebrity athletes, professional basketball players Moses Malone and Artis Gilmore, both African Americans. The ad copy reads, "You can get the same kind of comfort Moses Malone and Artis Gilmore rely on." Aspirational wording telling the broad, weekend warrior buyer that he can be like these African-American sports stars. Beginning in the mid-1980s, celebrity and non-celebrity African-American representations accelerated, reflecting society's overall acceptance of African-Americans as aspirational figures. With the growth of the Hispanic population, Hispanics represented 9% of the U.S. population in 1990, their culture was impacting broader U.S. society. This impact included the increasing popularity of soccer. In this 1990 humor appeal ad for Champion athletic wear, we see a group of dark-skinned, dark-eyed soccer players. Given the broad reach of Sports Illustrated, we can assume this ad targeted readers far beyond Latinos. The growth of African-American imagery in the 1980s became an explosion in the 90s and focused increasingly on sports celebrity images. By the late 1990s, consumers were willing to see advertisers push the envelope with a juxtaposition of models. In this 1997 ad for His Sportswear, the black model leads the white model. In this 1997 ad for Tommy Hilfiger, we see a multiracial group of friends frolicking on the beach. Blacks and whites mix comfortably in imagery that would have been very rare 30 years earlier. Here we see a similar grouping, also from Hilfiger, also from 1997. By the late 1990s, consumers were willing, if not anxious, to see increasing multicultural representations in advertising. In this 1997 special insert in Sports Illustrated from Levi's, we see the first Asian imagery found in this study, added to the African American images. The increasing proportion of Hispanics to the overall U.S. population, in 2000 Hispanics surpassed African Americans in their proportion of the U.S. population at 12.5%, meant that soccer also gained popularity. Along with soccer came multicultural imagery. Here is a 1999 ad for Adidas men's fragrance featuring a black and a Hispanic image. This 2000 ad for Jockey underwear features an Asian model, again representing to Sports Illustrated readers what fitness and attractiveness look like. In this 2000 ad for Gap clothing, again we see a multicultural grouping. In addition to the 6 light-eyed, light-haired models, we see a grouping of an African American, an Asian, and a possible Hispanic image. In this 2001 ad for Adidas men's fragrance, we see a juxtaposition that would have been impossible less than 40 years before. In addition to the black Hispanic soccer players, we also see a black male model and a white female model in an embrace. Although it can be argued that some clothing fragrance firms purposely select provocative images, Adidas is not known to be one of them. And Sports Illustrated does not target the most edgy, fashion-conscious man as its reader. Clearly, the average reader of Sports Illustrated had no problem associating multiracial pairings with fun and even love. In these three 2001 and 2002 ads for jockey underwear, the same African-American model represents the fit, healthy, happy everyman to the broad Sports Illustrated readership. It is not just black men who identify or aspire to be like him. It is all men. In this 2003 ad for John Henry Sportswear, Mexican-American boxer Oscar de la Hoya shows Sports Illustrated readers what they should wear when relaxing. In the early part of the 21st century, the African-American image that Sports Illustrated readers began to see was of these hypermasculine, solemn models in these 2002 and 2003 ads for Under Armour. With the growing popularity of hip-hop music and its lifestyle, readers sought out gritty, urban, and often multicultural images to associate with fashion. This 2004 ad for Starter Sportswear features two African-American images. Results from this study indicate that consumers have come not only to accept, but to expect to see minority images in advertising. This evolution can be attributed to demographic, social, and governmental changes, and is a reflection of the cultural transformation that has occurred in the minds of American consumers. African Americans were virtually invisible in advertisements through 1970. Following the Civil Rights Movement, there was a sudden shift in the prominence of African American models in ads in Sports Illustrated, with African American models presented in the foreground of the ads. In addition to the prominent position that African American models were beginning to take, they also began to increase in number as well. In the 1980s, there was an explosion in the number of ads that included African American models, with many of these ads featuring athletes. By 2000, African Americans accounted for 12.3% of the U.S. population, but appeared in 22% of ads between 1995 and 2004. African American models have moved from service or background roles in ads where they supported white models to ads in which they were featured in the foreground of ads among white models. This was followed by ads in which African Americans were the sole models. African American models have been empowered in these leadership roles. By the end of the 20th century, African American athlete celebrity models were common in Sports Illustrated and the media at large. American consumers were looking toward African Americans for representations of what attractive, healthy men, not just attractive, healthy African American men, look like, wear, and otherwise consume. Recent works by authors such as Heathen Potter, Tate, and Kitwana delve further into the source of the increasing acceptance and embrace of minority, primarily African American, images in all popular culture, referencing frameworks such as cultural appropriation and their explanations of this shift. At the same time, the incidence of multicultural representations in ads also increased in a variety of product categories targeted at broad male audiences. The first Hispanic image identified in the study sample was in 1969, but Hispanic American models did not increase in prominence or popularity at the same rate as African American models. In 2000, Hispanics made up 12.5% of the U.S. population, exceeding the African American population. However, Hispanics appeared in only 1.2% of ads between 1995 and 2004, compared to 22% of ads for African Americans. It should be noted that in the absence of a name, caption, or other cue that can be used to help infer the ethnicity of a model, it can be hard to discern between Hispanic models and non-Hispanic models that may look Hispanic. Although there have been few clearly Hispanic models represented in Sports Illustrated, there has been a move away from models with blonde hair and blue eyes in favor of models with brown hair and brown eyes. In 2000, Asian Americans made up 3.6% of the U.S. population and were the fastest growing ethnic minority in the country. However, Asian Americans remained largely invisible through the 1990s. The first Asian images were not found in this study sample until 1997, when Asian models were seen in supporting roles in a Levi's ad. Between 1995 and 2004, Asian images appeared in only 1.9% of the ads in this study sample. Although there has been an increasing use of Asian American models, their appearance in ads is still a rarity in Sports Illustrated, as well as other advertising vehicles. The context in which consumers expect to see Asian ad images is also important. Asian men still do not stand on their own in ads and are used almost exclusively in supporting roles. Also, marketing literature informs us that consumers expect Asian American models most frequently in stereotypical roles and ads for technology products and services. The importance of African Americans in sports and popular culture is clearly demonstrated in the manner and frequency in which they are featured in Sports Illustrated covers and advertisements. As the cultural status of Hispanic and Asian Americans rise, consumers will demand to see more representations of those groups in advertisements as well. The cultural lens through which we view ethnic imagery and the expectations that consumers have developed favor multicultural representations in the media. With an increasing multicultural population and barring xenophobic rise in the future, consumers are and will be increasingly willing, if not anxious, to see growing multicultural representations in American advertising.